Well, hey, everybody there at Unleashed. I'm so excited to share with you. My name is David Jesse. I'm with a ministry called One Child. We bring hope to hard places by helping churches connect with communities of churches around the world to help release children from poverty and bring hope to hard places. And so one of the exciting things about Unleashed this year is that we get the opportunity to share with you a little bit about how to start a podcast. Let me kind of explain a little bit about how a guy from One Child is doing that. About 5 years ago, my two sons and I, they were 12 and 16 at the time. We decided that we would take something that we loved, which was Star Wars, and build a podcast around it. And we were terrible at it. I knew nothing about podcasting at the time. We took a pretty terrible microphone, set it up on our kitchen table in California, and recorded the first episode of what would become Tatooine Sons, a Star Wars podcast. And before long, something amazing happened. It propelled our podcast sort of into the fan consciousness, and we ended up having to become pretty good at podcasting really quickly. And so I've spent the last 5 years learning about podcasting and developing my skills in that, and now I get to help you avoid all of the crazy and terrible mistakes that I made when building a podcasting. We also do this here at One Child, and so I want to make sure you have the opportunity to subscribe to the podcast that we have that I actually produce and host for One Child. It's called the Mission Pastors Podcast, and the whole goal behind it is for us to take missions pastors and find out what they're doing at the local and global level with missions and let them share about what God's doing so that you can learn from churches and missions pastors and ministries all around the country what they're doing successfully to reach the world with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so make sure you scan that QR code on the screen right there and get the opportunity to subscribe to that podcast as well. Well, this is the roadmap. This is where we're going to go. The whole promise of this session is that I'm going to take the next 20 minutes or so and show you how to go from the idea of a podcast to at least having the plan to launch a successful podcast. And if you do everything that we talk about in the next few minutes, you're about 60 days away from having a successful podcast. And so this is where we're going to go with it. We're going to talk about the most important question that you actually need to ask yourself before you or your church or your ministry launches a podcast. We're going to talk about why you should start a podcast, and more importantly, why you should start a podcast right now. We're going to help you decide what your show's all about and the things that you need to ask yourself in order to develop a good show concept. And then just as important as that is, who is your show for? Who are you talking to on the podcast? And so you can craft your story, craft your content, and bring on guests or the different elements of your show so that it appeals to a specific listener, so that you can make sure that your story resonates with them. Then we're going to talk about the different types of shows that are out there, and you can sort of see where you think your concept fits and what type of show that needs to be. We're going to talk a little bit about technical stuff. How do you do this? Because if you're thinking about it and you've never done this before, it may seem a little bit overwhelming when you think about microphones and hosting sites and all of the different things with that. So we'll talk about those things. And then I'll give you that 60-day roadmap. Again, the promise of this is if you do all of this pre-work and you get all of that done, then you're going to have about 60 days when you finish that from when you should launch. And I'll explain what that's all about. So before we do that, I want to frame this and help you understand why I feel like it's so important as you're watching this as a pastor at a church, as a leader in a church, as a leader in a ministry, why I believe that podcasts are capable of changing the world. The reality is you get to take whatever God is speaking to you and in your heart, and you get to communicate it in a long form format where you have somebody you're speaking directly into their ears. They're listening to what you have to say, and they're focused on your message, and you get to do that over and over and over again. They're choosing to do this. This is another opportunity for you to get your message to the world. I'm reminded of Romans 10:17. Faith comes from hearing, and hearing by the word of God. And so you get to have that opportunity to share that. So I really do believe in podcasting. But before you decide to do a podcast, I want you to understand the question that you need to ask yourself, and that is why you want to start a podcast. And right now I'm kind of thinking about churches. I'm thinking about churches that are thinking maybe podcasting would be an amazing marketing tool to get the word out about their church so that people from all over in their community start coming to their church. If that's your hope for having a podcast, I have bad news for you. This isn't the right tool for that. This isn't a marketing tool for you to reach your community. Think about podcasting as something that lives on the web for anybody in the world to listen to. And so you're not going to be targeting individuals within your city or your own neighborhood or your own community with this. You could be speaking to somebody completely on the other side of the world. And so podcasting shouldn't be about marketing your church or your ministry or your brand. It really should be about you getting your message out. And so that's the first thing that I want you to start asking yourself is why you want to start a podcast in the first place. Really take some time to think that through. Write down some ideas. Think about the reasons and get those on paper with it. There's a video that I want to show you from the comedian and speaker, Michael Jr., that is going to really help you kind of understand why you should start a podcast and get that idea on paper. So what Michael is saying on here is when you get your why right, the what takes care of itself. As you saw that choir director, the first time he sang Amazing Grace, everything was technically great. He's got a fantastic voice. He's singing all the notes exactly the way that you're supposed to sing it. But he was just trying to do it technically correct. And then when Michael encouraged him to kind of think about his why, the purpose behind the song that he was singing, where he talks about, sing it like you're in the hood. Everything that he did changed, but more importantly, not just what he did and why and how he did it, but the reaction of everybody in the audience changed along with it because he understood why he was doing what he was doing. Everybody else listening to that responded differently. As you understand why you're going to have a podcast and you really get that firm in your heart and you build everything off of that foundation, what you're going to do is you're going to find that your listeners and everybody that hears this podcast are going to respond to it very differently. You can get all the technical things right and still not communicate effectively if you don't have the why. So here's some reasons why I think you should have a podcast once you understand your personal reason why. First of all, podcasting is booming like crazy. More than half of Americans over the age of 12 are listening to podcasts. A third of them listen at least once a week. That's an opportunity for you to reach more and more people with the message God's laid on your heart. 65% of podcast listeners tune in using portable devices such as smartphones and tablets. Podcasting reaches people at times when other mediums don't. When I think about YouTube and videos and things like that, I mean, you're watching a video here. When I think about podcasting, I don't think about video podcasts as much as I think about audio podcasting. Video podcasting makes somebody have to stop for a long period of time and watch a YouTube video or something on screen, which is great, but they have to devote a significant period of time to that and focus exclusively on that for it to have an impact. What's happening with audio podcasts is it allows you to listen to a podcast while you're driving to work, listen to a podcast while you're working on things in the office, while you're doing dishes, while you're working out. It allows you to reach your listeners when you have an audio podcast. You reach them at a time when you may not otherwise be able to reach them. So I love the portability of it. And 82.4% of podcast listeners, once they get hooked on podcasts, they listen to a lot of podcasts. And so you have the opportunity for them to not just hear your message once, but to go back and listen to previous episodes, subscribe to the podcast, and hear you every time you release a new one. So it's fantastic. This is why I think, especially when I want to talk to pastors and church leaders right now, this is why churches need to be starting a podcast. You're already creating content. The pandemic sort of forced most churches, even if they didn't already have live stream and video and online services, it forced them to move towards that. And so the odds are you already have a video version of your message that's being presented at your church every single weekend. It's not that complicated to take that content that you're already creating every single week and just move that into a podcast at the very least. Put that into an audio format, create a conversation at the opening, create a conversation at the ending where you talk about some specific things and emphasize that, and then repackage that and get that out there. It's a great opportunity there. The other thing is churches, honestly, they struggle with communication. And I don't understand why, because I know pastors and church leaders, you guys are doing your announcements. You either probably have video announcements and you're sharing constantly. You've got your social media, you're doing all this. But then, the pastor will get up there and he'll talk about some event, and you'll have people in the congregation that should know about it that afterwards are like, I didn't know anything about that. I hadn't heard about it. So this gives you another opportunity to reach people with your messages and communicate with them. And it allows you also to share new voices from your community. There may be people that wouldn't be comfortable on a video setting that are a part of your church. They're volunteering, they're serving, they're leading, and being on video is something that they're not really that comfortable with. But you could sit down in a room with a microphone and just have a conversation with them, and they would feel very differently because there's no bright lights and cameras and all of that. So they are able to participate, and you can share their voices as well with it. Now, hopefully you kind of understand, and if you're watching this, you probably have already decided, I know why I want to have a podcast. I know why I want to start one, but you're maybe hesitating as to when the timing of it should be. The reality is there's never going to be a perfect time to start a podcast. If you're waiting for that moment to happen, you're just going to continue to wait. A point of just transparency here. I was trying to get One Child to launch their podcast for 3 years before they actually did it. And they kept coming back to me over and over and over again and saying, we want to do this. It's just not the right time. And then finally, one of the leadership sent me a newsletter they got from Carey Nieuwhof. And in it, Carey Nieuwhof said this quote, jumping into podcasting is a little like planting a tree. You may have heard a quote like this before. The best time to do it was years ago, but the second best time to do it is today. And when she sent that to me, I replied back immediately and said, are we ready to start a podcast? Because there's never going to be a better time than today. And that's when we decided to do it. I want to encourage you to understand that if you're going to do this, don't wait for the perfect timing, jump right into it now. Now, once you make the decision to do this, it is when the work really starts. And so I want to give you some questions that you should be asking yourself as you start to frame what this podcast will sound like and what you're reaching out to. First thing is, what are the specific goals that you have for your podcast? What are you trying to do with it? What is the purpose that you're having? We've talked about that, but I want you to write down very specific goals. And if it's listeners, then that's great. If you want to have subscribers, talk about that. Think about what's realistic. But maybe it's so you can create conversations with people in your church that you're not having otherwise, and you can highlight them. Maybe it's about talking about topics that you aren't capable of talking about from the pulpit or the stage on Sunday morning, that you can have a more intimate conversation about in a podcasting format. Think about those types of questions with it. Second, what are the strengths that you bring to the podcast? Know who you are and what you can do. Are you a great interviewer? That's fantastic. Are you just somebody who can turn on a microphone and start talking, and it doesn't really matter if you have anybody there listening to you? Well, that's going to help craft what that podcast is going to sound like and what format you're going to do. The other thing you want to think about is, who do you want to include in your podcast? Are they, other pastors, other leaders, ministry people? Is it, again, people in your church? Is it people in your community? Maybe as a pastor, your podcast at your church needs to be about people that are making a difference in your community. Maybe that's what you want this to be about. So you're interviewing business leaders and other community leaders that are trying to make your community a better place, and you want to celebrate them. These are the types of things, questions you want to be thinking about with that. And then 4, what do you want your podcast to say about you? Everything that you do in this podcast is going to be an extension of the message that you're communicating and everything that you're doing in your church, your social media, your website, your other marketing, your other communications. It should fit into it, not be something separate. So you should be thinking about that question for your church and then applying that same question to what you're doing with your podcast. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is your opportunity to reach out to me. I'm going to give you my contact information again at the end. If you want to have a digital version of this, and I'm sure we can include this as well on the website, I'm going to give you a workbook that's going to help you walk through this. But I want you to understand that a big part of the preparation for this podcast is you creating what's called an avatar for it. You want to be thinking, who is your show for? Now, when we created the Star Wars podcast that I created with my sons, and when I created the One Child, the Missions Pastor podcast for that, we sat down and we thought about who this podcast is, and one person. We created a name. We talked about their family situation. We talked about the kind of job that they have. We talked about when they listen, why they listen, what they're hoping to get out of it. These are the types of things that you need to be thinking about when you get ready to craft every single episode of your podcast and think, does this individual that you're creating this podcast for, is he going to get or is she going to get from this podcast what you want them to get from it? And so I will include this worksheet as well as some others in that email that we can send to you later from it. Now, there's lots of different styles of podcasts, styles of shows that are out there. And so you need to think about what kind of show that you're making. I'm thinking about some different podcasts that I like to listen to. You have a podcast called The Calling. It's hard to say that, by Jim Cymbala at Brooklyn Tabernacle. This is a show where you can tell when you listen to it, he's crafted out an episode and he's going through an outline in that episode, but he's still very kind of extemporaneous in it. He doesn't have guests, but he's building from episode to episode off of a story that he wants to be telling and a message that he wants to be getting across, but he's doing it really extemporaneously without guests. And then you have guys like David Platt. And when I listen to his Pray the Word, he has a verse and then he just opens up and starts talking. And you can tell when you listen to David, he has no idea where he's going to end up with it, but it's his personality that's coming through. And so that's the style of show. I call that the freestyler type of show. Then you have, we talked about Carey Nieuwhof earlier. Carey's is a traditional interview podcast. He has a guest, he brings them on. That guest is prepared for the interview. Carey's prepared for the interview. They have a conversation around a specific topic, whether or not it's a book or something like that, but it allows them to have a specific conversation regarding that. And then I think about guys like Al Mohler, who he has what I would describe as a monologue podcast. It's different than what you see with David Platt and Jim Cymbala in the fact that he has scripted that podcast out word for word, and he's reading that script. And then, you can have a general conversation type podcast like the Happy Rant. That's where some guys just get together and they have a conversation. They have a theme for that podcast, but these guys know each other. It's the same guys on that show every single time. It's like the podcast I do with my sons, where you just have a conversation around a specific topic, and it's a little bit kind of a combination of the interview and the freestyler podcast. So think about which style best suits you and your strengths and who you're speaking to and the message that you're trying to get across. So now that's when you have to start thinking about all the technical pieces with it. There's lots of different options on it. It's generally, you can do this pretty affordably. When you think about microphones, you could go with a microphone that you get on Amazon, like the Samson Q20, which is, like a $70 microphone, pretty affordable, great sound, plug and play on your laptop, and you can go with it from there all the way up to a professional podcasting mic, like the Rode Pod mic. And if you're doing this in a studio or whatever, and you want to have a specific room that's set up for that, you may want to go ahead and have, those higher end options available to you. You want to have a mixer. There's lots of different options that are out there, but you're going to need to have the sound going through a mixer. I recommend for podcasts, something as simple as the Zoom PodTrack P4. With that, you need to have a DAW of some sort, some way to edit this, add some different effects to it so that it sounds more professional. You could go with something as simple as Audacity, which is what we've been using for our podcasts for years. As long as you are able to deal with some of the clunkiness of that kind of thing. It's not that hard to use. You can get something for free with that, all the way up to utilizing options like Zencaster and Squadcast in there. You need to have folders using an online storage system with different options in there. And you're going to want to find different, backings, tracks and like intros and outros and all of that. There's lots of options that are available. I recommend just going into something like YouTube Audio Library if you want to keep your budget in check and find good options for that. You want to have great art for it. You can see some different options that are on the screen there with show art. My recommendations for show art is you keep it clean, keep it simple. And let's talk for just a second about the naming of your podcast. There's lots of different things that are out there. The podcast that I do with my sons sounded really cool for us because there's a planet in Star Wars. If you're not a Star Wars fan, you wouldn't know that, but there's a planet in Star Wars called Tatooine, and that planet in that universe has 2 suns. So we thought it would be cute to name our podcast Tatooine Sons, but SONS, which sounds really cool until you think about everybody types it in wrong when they hear it, and we have to explain that it has the O. So think about the name of your podcast from those types of things. I also look at a guy that I absolutely love. He's an author and a speaker named Andy Andrews. He's got a podcast that's named terribly. It's called The Professional Noticer. It says nothing about what that podcast is about, and it's just confusing. I love guys like Tim Ferriss and Gary Vaynerchuk, or Gary V is how he's known, where their podcast just says exactly who they are and what it's about. That's what we did with One Child with the Missions Pastor podcast. It's kind of hard to get confused as to what that podcast is about. And so I encourage you, when you name your podcast, to do that. And then when you create those graphics and those show art, use something. If you're not already using something like Canva, it's so affordable. It's easy to use, $14 a month, and you can do some amazing graphic things in a really easy way on that. You're going to need a hosting service. And when I say that, I'm not talking about who's hosting the podcast. I'm talking about a place to house that podcast and then distribute it. That's another beautiful thing about podcasting. If you get a good host, and there's some options here on the screen from Lisbon, Podbean, Spreaker, there's lots of others that are out there. These are 3 that I have experience with and that I would recommend. But once you get a good host in place and you upload to that host the final episode and then publish it, the beautiful thing about that is it distributes it out to all of the different podcast apps. Apple, Spotify, Castbox, all of the different apps that people are listening to, it's going to end up on those, which is another beautiful thing about podcasting. That's where it becomes different than something like blogging, because blogging, you go up to a website, you load it on that, and then you have to figure out how to get it to the world. With podcasting, it automatically distributes and gets it available to people. So you need to make sure that that's in place. There's some options there for you. Now, once you've done all of that, you've kind of thought through why you're going to have a podcast, who that podcast's for, what the style of the show is going to be. You've identified the equipment, and you've got the equipment in place. You've got a plan in place for editing and uploading it to a host, and all of those things are done. Once that's set up, you have to start thinking about where do I go from here, right? How do I actually get this from idea to execution? And so here we have on the screen, you've got sort of a checklist that I'm going to include in this for you, where you can start going through and thinking through the different steps and putting these on your calendar. I recommend you sit there with your team that's going to help you with this, and you think about, when do we want this podcast to hit the world? Is it January 1st? Is it March 1st? Whatever. And then back it up 60 days and make sure that all of these steps are getting executed throughout that time period. You're going to need to, 60 days out, be thinking about getting that registration for your hosting service, ordering your equipment. You're going to want to start thinking about 50 days out, those first several episodes and what your topics are, and start brainstorming the guests. Develop the creative elements in there, like your intros and your outros and any bumpers that you might have in there. 40 days before the episode, you're going to want to download that digital audio workstation, that editing software, and make sure you start understanding how to use it. Create your folders. You'll want to have a 60-second trailer that you can upload. Let me stop and explain kind of why that's critical. Most podcasting distribution platforms, most apps for it, when you upload to your host, it'll show up on those almost immediately, except for Apple. Apple takes a little bit longer for that first episode to get in place. So I recommend you create basically a 60-second commercial for the podcast that will give a description of what the show's about, give a feel for what that podcast is going to be like when someone listens to it, and you get that uploaded to your host so that host can then distribute it to all the podcasting applications, specifically Apple Podcasts. And that allows Apple Podcasts that 15 to 30 days that's required before it actually starts showing up in the app. I've seen churches upload that first episode, go onto their social media, go into their next church service, tell everybody in their church all about this new podcast, and 50% of the people in there are using iPhones, and they go to try to download it, and it's not there yet. And you lose that opportunity. Once they've tried to download it and they can't find it, they're probably not going to try again. So that's an important piece of that. 30 days, you've got that uploaded. You're scheduling out with your guests. You're outlining your episodes. 20 days before you're going to record your first several episodes, you'll want to release multiple episodes at once. Let me explain why. I recommend releasing 3 episodes at the same time to launch the podcast. You want someone that finds this podcast when they first find it. If they like what they're listening to, they're naturally, if they're a podcast listener, going to want to go and listen to other episodes. And if you don't have those episodes available to them, then you may lose them as a subscriber. The statistics show when someone has listened to 3 episodes of a podcast, they subscribe to it. And so that's going to be an important piece of that. Sign up for some different services. I'll include some information about Auphonic, how you can clean up the audio and kind of make sure the levels are right through that. 10 days before the episode, you get that edited. You get those, you're moving those out. You're beginning your promotion of it. You're sending your thank yous. So always remember when you have guests to reach out to them afterwards and thank them for being your guests. You get those uploaded to your host. You get that promotion out there. You start outlining your next episodes, and then you take some time to celebrate once it's released and have a lot of fun. Send it out to the guests that were on that. Send it out to all of the people in your church and in your network and let them download it. That initial wave of downloads is going to be so important to you to make this feel real and to really build the momentum that you want on that. I love this quote by Walt Disney. I'm a Disney guy. And it's really how I want you to kind of finish thinking about what I've shared with you today. The way to get started is to stop talking about it and start doing it. If you're watching this breakout session, it's because you've already been thinking about having a podcast, and you've probably been thinking about it for a while. I want to encourage you to take the steps to just get things started. Once you make the decision, you pick that release date and you start the planning. From there, the momentum will begin to build, and you'll be able to continue to see that come to reality with it. Again, please subscribe to the One Child Podcast, the Mission Pastor Podcast presented by One Child. We would love to have you check that out. And then if you want some more information, my information is on the screen here. That's my cell phone. Feel free, text me, call me. I'm open to helping you with this. That's my email address if you want to have any information. I'm willing to anybody watching this to spend 60 minutes, 90 minutes with you on Zoom, answering questions, helping you make some of these decisions, working with you to do this. I want to see you take this idea of podcast and really make it come true. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of the sessions that you're watching on this.